If you cover video games for long enough, one of the things that you will constantly hear is the word content. Developers, publishers, PR people, the media, and everybody else involved in games uses that word a lot. It's a word that I have found increasingly frustrating to hear, and that's why I'm making this video today, because it is an insult to the artistry of games. It's a terrible, dirty word, and I'm going to explain why. Content is a word that came from the bland, sterile, and near dystopian world of business, and it is used to describe product, not art, product. Creativity, artistry, originality, and everything else that we usually associate with games or with art mean nothing in the world where you're talking about content. And while you would expect the suit-wearing producers running the likes of Netflix, Apple, Spotify, or the Hollywood studios to talk about what they're producing as content, as far as I can tell, in the games industry, in the games industry, and only in the games industry, the actual creators also think about their work in those terms. To put it another way, Shakespeare didn't sit back and think, man, I've created some really great content when he finished writing Hamlet. Orson Welles wasn't thinking about how he could create a sequel to Citizen Kane to give fans more content as he was shooting that film. But if you listen to the producer or developer of World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, Fortnite, anything else that's kind of popular, every second word is content. It is incredible. If it was a drinking game, you would be passed out drunk before you got through half an interview with some of these guys. The amount of times they can fit content into their interviews responses is just, it's mind-blowing. You probably haven't thought about any of this, and that's fine. We don't generally talk about the words we use when we describe our games. But I actually think that this is an important topic, and that's why I'm making the video, because the usage of the word content goes a long way to describing the way that game producers think, game creators think, and those thought processes don't actually paint a pretty picture for the future of game development. So content is a common enough word, of course, but where does it come from when we're talking about things like video games? There was an essay written by Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft and father of technology if you want. He wasn't really, but he often gets credited with it, but he definitely did found Microsoft, and he wrote this essay back in 1996 titled Content is King. When you hear game developers or publishers talking about content, it's an explicit reference back to that essay. Sometimes they actually go all the way and say content is king, other times they just refer to content, but it's always a reference back to that essay, and I know this because as a person who's been involved in business writing for over a decade, anybody involved in technology who wears a suit is a little too in love with that essay. It's kind of creepy. It's like a Bible if they love their Bible a little bit too much. It's incredible how influential that essay has actually been. In that essay, Gates writes, Content is where I expect much of the real money will be made on the internet, just as it was in broadcasting. So right from the outset, the focus of the word content is defined purely in terms of its ability to spin money. Gates wasn't concerned about what the content is about, how it's created, or even why it's created. Beyond its ability to earn ever greater amounts of cash, the quality and integrity of the content is largely irrelevant, as Gates makes even more clear later on. When he writes, one of the exciting things about the internet is that anybody with a PC and modem can publish whatever content they create. In a sense, the internet is the multimedia equivalent of a photocopier. It allows material to be duplicated at low cost, no matter the size of the audience. That's right. To Gates, content is there to be created in vast quantities, duplicated to infinity, and then distributed as widely as possible. Again, none of this has anything to do with the artistry and/or creativity, quality, or integrity of what's being created. It is purely about providing stuff to consumers to compulsively consume, and then for the person who created that content to earn money from it. And of course, Bill Gates would think about things in those terms. Bill Gates ran a company that sold software and equipment that the content was experienced on, so it was in his best interest to encourage as much of it as possible. And it was, and it still is, Microsoft is a company of predominantly suit-wearing businessmen and businesswomen who have never stepped foot into an arts faculty. Never. Gates' interest in content started and stopped at its monetary value. I'd like to hope that most of us can agree that video games are more than their monetary value. And yet, across the entire industry, the language that Microsoft used, or Bill Gates used in that essay, is the one that we have adopted in talking about games. Words that should not be uttered outside of the marketing department of a developer are used by the entire development team, from the producer to the director, through to the artist, through to the writer and the coders. Everybody's talking about content, and that's when the spokesperson for a company isn't the actual marketing manager. And this is a little bit of a digression, but I do not understand why companies keep putting marketing people up to talk about games and why people keep listening to them, because marketing people are there to sell the game. They are not involved with the creative side of it. They don't understand the creative side of it. Most of them don't have much experience with the arts themselves. Their ideas are simply about how to make money. And if you think that the word content is an isolated example of this in action, it's not. It's actually not. It's quite common that these kinds of words have infiltrated the way that we talk about games. Because we've allowed ourselves to talk about video games in what is literally corporate suit-wearing marketing speak, other corporate suit-wearing marketing speak has become a real plague on the games industry and a real part of our everyday conversations about video games. I'll give you another example. Just one of many, but this one is quite new and therefore is being talked about a lot at the moment. Games as a service. You have almost certainly heard about this if you play video games. It's come into the use over the past 2 or so years to describe games that people continually play and the developer and publisher continue to update and support so that people continue to play them. They're games that effectively go on forever, in other words. And Ubisoft and Activision and EA are all very keen on this because having people locked into a single game is good for their revenue. That term comes to us from the early days of cloud computing, about 15 years ago now, where suit-wearing businessmen and businesswomen in the world of professional IT would talk about things like software as a service and infrastructure as a service. There are heaps of others. There was platform as a service, security as a service. There were dozens of them. Every press release you'd get was something about as a service. Once again, these terms demonstrate absolutely no interest in the creativity and artistry of what is being created, because that's irrelevant. What's relevant when you start talking about things as a service is simply having an ongoing supply of something. It's a discussion point for monetization, not creativity, and it is being sold as a creative feature in video games. The reality is, anybody who is using the word content to describe their games isn't actually thinking about that game as a creative work. To them, it's a product. It's something to sell, get feedback on, change, and then sell some more. It's a loop. That loop offers no room for creative thought. And that's not to say it doesn't work as a product, because of course it does. One of the things you quickly realize about these suit-wearing businessmen and businesswomen is that the successful ones, or even the mildly successful ones, make money because they're good at making money. They know what they're talking about when it comes to making money. So when they say that the word content is a way to help the marketing team think about how to make money from the game, the entire organization seems to shift behind that word as well, so that the game can make the maximum amount of money. The guiding principle of content is to sell the maximum amount of stuff. So naturally, games that are treated as content will sell well. But it's still an insult to the idea that games are a form of creative expression, to use that term. The treatment of games as content puts them in the same category as logo design or advertisements. That's not to diss those things. They might be done well. They might be entertaining, appealing, or even informative. They may be something that sticks in your head for a very long time. They may be something that makes you recognize that brand across the entire world for the rest of your life. But those kinds of assets, which is what they're termed as, those kinds of creative assets, sometimes is what they're called. But they are different to art. They are not art. They are commercial product. They are not art. There are exceptions to this. When I when I interviewed Yoko Taro a few weeks ago, he didn't use the word content once. In fact, most indies and Japanese developers that I have spoken to genuinely don't appear to think about their work as content. They don't think about it in that particular way. But when you go into an interview with a major Western developer, whether you want to call them AAA developers or blockbuster developers or anything else, and as an interviewer you ask them a simple question such as what inspires you in your work, you naturally assume that they're going to talk about their favorite artists or their favorite films, their favorite books, or even other games that have inspired them. Stuff that is kind of formative to their own creative process. And then you expect them to talk about that creative process. What influences them, how they're influenced, how they go about thinking about their games, all of that kind of stuff. That's what you naturally expect when you ask a question like that. What you almost always get from these developers is something along the lines of the passion of the fans have inspired the whole team to continue creating great content. That's almost a rote reply. It is so common. If I had $1 for every time it was said, I would be a very wealthy person and not making videos like this. And of course, there's nothing wrong with fans enjoying a game, the game making a lot of money, the developer and the publisher being quite, profitable. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good thing because it means that everybody gets more games, which is ultimately great for everybody. But for the longest time, we've had game makers and the community insist that games are a form of art and a form of creative expression. And the purpose of this video is I've just got to wonder when we're actually going to start seeing people talk about games like that. Because as long as we keep using the word content to describe our games, we are not talking about the creativity or the artistry of video games. We're not. We're talking about games as a product. And if people want to talk about games as a product, then that's fine. But let's stop calling them art then, because you can't have it both ways. If they're art, we need to stop talking about them and thinking about them as content. If they're content, then we need to stop trying to, engage with them as works of art. Anyhow, thank you very much for listening in and tuning in on this video. I hope it was interesting. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and we will see you at the next video.